I chose that title. I wanted to be a little bit provocative. I wanted you to be a little bit skeptical. What could you possibly learn by studying somebody's eye movements as they're reading across the page of text for a short interval of time, like a second or a few seconds? So what I want to do is I want to start with one of my favorite quotes that I think really nicely puts this all in context. It's a quote by a fellow named Philip Goff in a famous paper called 1 Second of Reading. And the quote is, "On the inside, the reader has rotated his eyes only a few millimeters, but on the inside, there has been a rapid succession of intricate events. Clearly, this succession could only be the product of a complex information processing system. It contains components that are asked to perform amazing feats with amazing rapidity and precisely in concert." So in a nutshell, this quote encapsulates my interest as a scientist. I really want to understand what these amazing components are and how they interact in real time to determine when and where the eyes move as we're reading text. Okay, so you might ask yourself, well, what are those components? Well, at a minimum, they include things like visual processing, but also attention and oculomotor control to actually move the eyes across the page, and importantly, language. And in addition to that, it's also necessary to understand how these components interact with each other, right? So if you just had a model of language processing, that would not be sufficient to understand how all these systems interact in real time. Okay, so what I'm going to do for the remainder of this lecture is just kind of talk about two of my main programs of research, both related to eye movements and reading. And what I'm going to do it in a roughly chronological order to kind of give you a little bit of sense for my background and the people I've worked with, although Dennis, you did a really nice job. A lot of what I'm going to say is probably now not that necessary, but I was born in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and despite all you might have heard, I was actually, well, it's not really that interesting. It's very flat, but like a lot of Iowans, I ended up going to one of the state universities. I ended up going to Iowa State University, where I was very fortunate to meet up with Professor Veronica Dark. And at the time when I met her, it was kind of a transition period in my life, and I wasn't the best student on campus. I think around the time that I met her, I was considering dropping out of the university and becoming a Marine Corps flight aviator. I had taken the naval flight exam and was just about ready to do that. But then I went back for one final semester. I met Veronica. I took a class with her on cognitive psychology. She was kind enough to allow me to work in her lab, and that kind of changed things for me. So during the last 2 years at the university, I worked really, really hard, applied to a number of graduate programs, and was fortunate enough to end up in Amherst, Massachusetts, University of Massachusetts, Amherst, working with these two fellows, Professors Keith Rayner and Sandy Polachek. Now, these guys literally wrote the book on the psychology of reading, which is basically the book that researchers who are interested in reading consult when they have a question about what's happening in the mind during reading. And as Dennis mentioned, these two men are giants in the field. To the extent that my career has been successful, I really owe it to these gentlemen because they really provided a huge opportunity for me to work with them. So that being said, let me give you a little bit of background about what they do. They had spent big parts of their careers studying eye movements and reading, and in order to do that, you need to know a little bit about the technology and the methodology that's used. So what I have here on the left is a picture of an eye tracker. This is an old school dual Purkinje image eye tracker, which basically records the movement of the eye using a collimated beam of infrared light. So basically it shines a light into the eye, there are reflections which are picked up, and using trigonometry, the eye tracker can track the position of the eye in real time. But on top of that, the computer, which collects the data, also can control what is being displayed on the monitor as a function of where the participant is actually looking. And that basic methodology allows for gaze contingent display change experiments. And just to give you a sense for what those look like, what I have here are, well, it's a diagram, 3 panels, In the top panel, I show a line of text across 3 successive fixations, and you can see the text doesn't really change. In the middle panel, I'm showing a moving window paradigm where the word that's being looked at and the word immediately to the right is always visible, but the letters outside of that window have been replaced by X's. And what you can see is that as the eye position moves, this window of normal text moves along with it. Okay? And down in the bottom panel here, you can see that that moving window has been made more asymmetrical, extending to the right 14 character spaces and to the left 4 character spaces. So by manipulating the nature of the window, its size, its symmetry, and the nature of the distorted information outside of the window, Keith and Sandy and their students were able to learn a tremendous amount about what happens in the mind during reading. Okay? And I'm going to tell you about some of that, but just to kind of give you a sense of what eye movements look like during reading, I have a little video here. And the red dot shows the point of fixation, and this is just some random text. And when I play this, you'll see that the red dot kind of moves along each line, making brief pauses called fixations, and these very rapid ballistic movements that move the eye from one fixation to the next. And those are called saccades. So if you plot the durations in milliseconds of fixations and the lengths of the saccades in terms of character spaces, you can actually learn something quite interesting about eye movements during reading. So first of all, most of the fixation durations are between 200 and 225, 250 milliseconds in duration, although there's a lot of variability. You can see that they extend from less than 100 up past 500. On top of that, approximately 85% of the content words and 35% of the function words are fixated at least once, and the majority of the saccades move the eyes forward, but approximately 10-15% of the saccades are actually regressions, which move the eyes back to earlier parts of the text. Okay, so those are some of the basic facts, and knowing what we know about the physiology of the eye and the fact that the type of photoreceptors that are necessary to perceive the fine details of letters are really limited to a small part of the retina, so kind of the central 2 degrees of the retina, an area called the fovea. That basically explains why most words are fixated in reading. Basically, you have to fixate them in order to perceive them. Okay, but the gaze contingent experiments of the type I mentioned earlier have taught us a lot more. So they've demonstrated that the perceptual span, or the region from which useful information is actually extracted from the printed page, extends beyond the fixated word. So typically, the perceptual span allows for the identification of letters up to about 7 or 8 character spaces to the right of fixation, and it allows for the discrimination of letter shapes up to about 11 or 12 character spaces to the right of fixation. And then you can discriminate between word boundaries, that is, the presence of a letter versus a blank space, up to about 14 or 15 character spaces to the right of fixation. Okay, and you may be saying to yourself, well, what does that reflect, or why is that important? Well, it indicates that visual acuity limitations is not the whole story, that the perceptual span and how much information we extract from the printed page really is a function of attention. And probably the most compelling evidence for this is the simple fact that the perceptual span extends asymmetrically to the right in languages like English and German and French, which are read from left to right. But if you look at languages like Hebrew, it actually extends to the left, right? Because those languages are read from right to left. Okay, and just to kind of give you an intuitive sense then for what reading is actually like, what I have now is a video clip that uses a filter to filter out all of the fine detailed information except right around the point of fixation. And what you're going to see is that reading is a little bit like a slideshow, where you get these brief slides presented and you get a limited amount of information, and then the eyes move on, and then you get the next slide. Okay, so that's supposed to give you some intuition for what is actually happening in the mind. Okay? Now, the work that Keith and Sandy have done has really nicely demonstrated that there's a large degree of separation between the decisions that your brain makes between where to move your eyes in reading versus when to move your eyes during reading. And coming to this first question, the where question, we know that readers typically fixate about a third of the way into a word in languages that are read from left to right. And this is called the preferred viewing location. However, because of motor error that's intrinsic to the oculomotor system, if you look at a distribution of fixation landing sites, those distributions tend to be normal in shape, so they look like bell curves. And in addition to that, we know that the targeting of the saccades, or the decision about where the eyes move, is largely determined by visual and oculomotor constraints. So properties intrinsic to the oculomotor system and visual acuity. Now, with respect to the when question, there is an overwhelming amount of evidence that fixation durations, or the amount of time that your eyes remain stationary, is influenced by a variety of variables that really do reflect immediate online cognitive processing. So for example, how often a word appears in printed text. So a word that's very common, like the word the, you will tend to skip that type of word more often, and you'll fixate it for a shorter amount of time than a less common word like the word ostrich. Okay, and we also know that words that are predictable within a given sentence context also are the recipients of fewer and shorter fixations. So this type of evidence suggests that there is, in fact, a very strong eye-mind link, that the local cognitive processing that happens as you're identifying printed words on a page really does influence the decision about when you should terminate the fixation on that word and start moving your eyes to the next word. Okay, so all of this is a background, and for those of you who were here in 2012, it probably does ring a little bit familiar. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to tell you a little bit about my work and how my work kind of fits into this type of research. So what I have here is a schematic diagram that basically just shows the scientific process, right? So anybody that's a scientist will recognize this. Science begins with observations. We observe phenomena that are interesting. And what we typically do is we try to generate some type of explanation of those phenomena. And these explanations can be of various types. Typically they're theories, they're verbal theories that explain causal relationships between variables of interest. But what I'm interested in doing is developing more formal theories, theories that are actually implemented as computer programs and mathematical equations. Okay, and those theories or models are then used to generate predictions, new hypotheses, which are then tested through experimentation. And if the results are consistent with those hypotheses, then typically you go back and you use the model or theory to generate new predictions, and this whole cycle continues. Otherwise, you go back to the drawing board and you have to develop a new theory. So the way I see my research, it's really focused on that box right there. I really am interested in developing very formal, precise descriptions of what happens in the mind as people are reading text. Okay, so when I arrived at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, I was fortunate enough to arrive at the right time. Keith and Sandy had been working on these types of problems for about 30 years, and they asked me if I wanted to become involved in developing a computational model of eye movement control and reading. And we did that. That was the 1998 Psych Review paper that Dennis mentioned. But since that time, I've continued working with Keith and Sandy and various other people, continuing to develop the model to make it more plausible, to extend its theoretical scope to even phenomena outside of reading. And because this has been such a large part of my research program, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the model. I'm going to show you some equations. I'm going to try to explain it in a way that's very intuitive, so hopefully it won't be daunting. And before I do that, I want to give you a reminder of what it is I'm trying to explain. So I'm trying to explain how these various processes interact with each other in real time to determine when and where the eyes move. Okay, so if you look at the colors of those various components, I set up this schematic diagram so they correspond very nicely. And this schematic diagram shows the easy reader model. Right? And so you can see right away the model makes assumptions about the oculomotor system and how saccadic programs are executed. It also says something about the visual system and the way early visual processing allows information, the low spatial frequency information, the coarse information, to be used for saccadic programming, and the fine detailed information to be used for word identification. And you can also see that attention plays a role, and that the word identification stage itself is divided into two substages. Okay? So I'm going to kind of unpack that, but I just kind of want to give you a lay of the land. So the first assumption of this model is that the type of attention that's necessary to support lexical processing, or the processing of words, is done in a completely serial manner. And what I mean by that is, if you look at the diagram, there's this attentional spotlight, and it's focused on exactly one word. So at any given point in time, only one word is going to be processed. And usually the attention spotlight corresponds to the point of fixation, but not always. So sometimes attention can be out ahead by a word or two. Okay, so attention selects a subset of the visual information for lexical processing. That lexical processing is completed in two stages. And the first stage is called the familiarity check. And basically what that corresponds to, it's a sense of familiarity that the word is in your vocabulary, and that lexical access, or the activation of the word's meaning, is very eminent. And so once the familiarity check completes, basically that provides a signal to begin programming a saccade to move the eyes to the next word. Okay? And saccadic programming is done in two stages, a labile stage and a non-labile stage. The labile stage basically refers to the initial saccadic programming, and if during that programming another saccade happens to be initiated, the second saccadic program will cancel the first. However, if the labile stage runs to completion and the non-labile stage starts, that saccadic program will be executed in an obligatory fashion. So it's kind of like a point of no return. And once that happens, of course, the saccade generator in the brainstem causes the eyes to move. Okay. At the same time this is going on, lexical processing continues with the second stage. And once the meaning of a word has been activated, that then signals attention to shift its focus to the next word. So there's this decoupling between the signal to begin programming an eye movement to move the eyes and the signal to shift the focus of attention to begin processing the next word. And usually these two things are lockstep pretty tightly, but they are decoupled to some extent. Okay. So to explain the model a bit more formally, all of these processes that I just talked about, they take a certain amount of time to complete. And the time it takes them to complete is determined by equations. And to add random variability into the process times to make it more realistic, what we do is we assume that the process times that are defined by equations are then used to set up gamma distributions. These are just distributions that have a certain amount of variability. And just to give you a sense for what a gamma distribution looks like, because I realize most of you probably don't know, at the top here I have a couple of examples of normal Gaussian distributions. They're kind of centered on 0 and have this nice bell shape. And down here I have gamma distributions. So they run from 0 to positive infinity, and they have this long skewed tail. And the reason we chose gamma distributions is because they very nicely describe motor process times, so the times to initiate motor movements, basically. So in the model, we assume that these process durations are distributed like gamma distributions with a certain amount of variability. And the first two processes in the model, the early stage of pre-attentive visual processing and the time it takes to shift attention, those are basically just set, the means are set equal to fixed values of 50 milliseconds and 25 milliseconds respectively. So what that means is that It takes 50 milliseconds on average for information to go from the eyes to the brain. And on average, it takes about 25 milliseconds for attention to shift from one word to the next. Okay. The familiarity check time is given by this simple equation where this parameter, which equals 104 milliseconds, is selected to maximize the goodness of fit between the model and the data that are being simulated. And that time can be decremented by amount that reflects the word's frequency in language and its predictability within a sentence context. So with all else being equal, words that are frequent in the language and or predictable in the language, it'll take less time to complete the familiarity check than words that are infrequent or unpredictable. Okay, and you can see that, again, the effect of word frequency and predictability, they're modulated by these parameters which take on certain values that allow the model to make accurate predictions. Okay, the familiarity check time is also updated by another equation which allows the model to simulate the effect of visual acuity limitations. So basically this epsilon is also a free parameter, and it has as an exponent the mean absolute deviation between the point of fixation in each of the words that are being attended to. So basically what this does is it causes the familiarity check time to increase in duration for words that are long and for words that are far from the point of fixation. Okay? On the lexical access stage, what you can see here is that the time it takes to complete lexical access is on average some fixed proportion delta of the time it takes to complete the familiarity check. And that has an important ramification that I'm going to mention in just a second. But before I do that, I want to just mention very quickly that the time it takes to program a saccade is actually broken down into these two stages. Remember the labile stage and the non-labile stage, which on average consume 125 milliseconds and 25 milliseconds. Okay, so this is the point I wanted to make. What I'm showing here is the time it takes to complete the familiarity check as a function of how difficult the word being attended to is to process. So you can imagine an easy word might be a frequent word, a difficult word might be a low frequency word, and the familiarity check increases linearly with the difficulty of the word. Okay, this shows the time to complete lexical access, and the orange line shows the time it takes for attention to shift from the word that's just been identified, represented by this blue line, to the next word. And you can see that that line, the orange line, occurs earlier in time than the green line, which represents the amount of time it takes for the eyes to actually move to the next word. So in this shaded region here, that's the amount of time that's available for parafoveally processing the upcoming word from the word that's being fixated. And you can see that that time varies as a function of how easy or difficult the fixated word is to process. So with all else being equal, if you're looking at an easy word, you have more time available for processing the upcoming word than if you're looking at a hard word. And that's also consistent with results such as those reported by Henderson and Ferrara. Okay, a few more equations, and then I'm going to show you some of the simulation results. So the assumption about how the saccade length that's actually executed as the eyes move from one location to the next. We know from a lot of different experiments that the saccade length measured in terms of character spaces is the sum of three components. So it's the sum of the intended saccade length, some amount of random error, and some amount of systematic error. So the random error basically just refers to a certain amount of Gaussian or normally distributed motor error that's centered on zero and with a standard deviation that increases linearly with the length of the intended saccade. So the longer the intended saccade, the more prone to motor error the saccade will be. Okay, the systematic error, actually the equation that determines the systematic error has two terms. The first one just reflects the difference between some optimal saccade length that in that language results in the least amount of systematic bias. So in English, it happens to be 7 character spaces, and the intended saccade length. And then that's weighted as a function of the logarithm of the fixation duration on the launch site word. Okay? Putting all of that together, what happens? Well, the model predicts, consistent with what we observe, that as the eyes move from one word to the next, they'll be directed towards the center of the targeted word, but the actual landing site distribution of the fixations are going to be approximately Gaussian in shape, with these missing tails that reflect cases where the eyes either undershot their target or overshot their target. Okay? And this happens for saccades that are approximately 7 character spaces in length. That's kind of the optimal saccade length in English. Okay? If the intended saccade is shorter than 7 character spaces, so for example 5 character spaces, the eyes will on average overshoot their intended target, and you can see the distribution shifts to the right, and there's this large missing tail. And conversely, if the intended saccade length is longer than 7 character spaces, the eyes will tend to undershoot their target, causing the distributions to shift to the left. And then finally, a saccade following a short fixation on the launch site word will also result in more motor error, causing the distribution to be flatter. Okay. 2 more equations. One is just that the saccades themselves, the actual physical movement of the eyes, takes on average 25 milliseconds. And then finally, there's an assumption that when the eyes initially land on a word, there is a certain probability that an automatic corrective refixation saccade will be initiated. And that probability varies as a function of the absolute distance in terms of character spaces between the fixation location and the center of the word that was just fixated. So the intuition here is that saccades that move the eyes towards either edge of a word, those fixation locations are very poor in terms of being able to process the word quickly. So there's a tendency to very quickly move the eyes back towards the center of the word. Okay, so putting all of these assumptions together, which I should mention again or emphasize, are based on research, empirical research that's been done by Keith and Sandy as well as other people. The model can actually account for a large amount of data that we observe in the reading literature. So what I'm showing here are the mean values observed and simulated for words of different frequencies. So I'm plotting word frequency along the x-axis, so very rare words, very common words. And I'm showing mean fixation durations for 3 dependent measures. So the red lines show the duration of the first fixation on a word. They can be fixated 1 or more times. The purple lines show the mean fixation durations for words that are fixated exactly once. And the blue lines show the durations of the sum of all first pass fixations on a word. And the dotted lines are the simulations, the solid lines are the actual data. So you can see the model does a pretty good job. And similarly, what I'm showing in the bottom panel is again word frequency effects, but this time showing the probability of fixating once in red, the probability of fixating 2 or more times in purple, and the probability of skipping a word in blue. Okay? So in terms of aggregate data, the model does a pretty good job. But on top of that, just to stick with this one example, here I'm showing, again, the 5 frequency classes of words, rare words, common words, and 2 of the dependent measures, first fixation durations in red and gaze durations in blue. And again, simulated data, the dotted lines, and observed data, the solid lines. So the model can account for the variability that's observed in the data. Okay, so over the past 15, 20 years, I and my colleagues and other people have actually used the model kind of as a theoretical framework to examine a variety of issues related to the effects of lexical variables, so things like word frequency, length, predictability, the effect of oculomotor variables, including simulations of moving window type experiments that I talked about earlier, how different languages and writing systems influence eye movements during reading, and then a variety of other miscellaneous theoretical issues. So for example, how words with multiple meanings, how the correct meaning is activated either in the presence or absence of supporting context, or the effect of aging, or something that I'm going to talk about at the end of the talk, the development of reading skill. Okay? So just to kind of give you an interim summary, I think that the main value of this model is that it provides an existence proof that cognition can in fact be fairly tightly coupled to decisions about when and where to move the eyes during reading. And this is despite the fact that cognition is relatively slow, it's very sluggish, and fixations are often very short in duration. And during the last 16 years, I guess, the model has really motivated a large number of empirical studies. And maybe more importantly, it's also inspired the development of new competing models, which have really facilitated research in this area. It's always great to have competitors who are trying to do things better than you are. And for those three reasons, I think the model's been successful in really advancing our understanding of what happens in the mind as people read printed text. Okay, so a lot of this work has continued over the years, but fortunately my career in grad school advanced and I actually ended up moving different places. Dennis mentioned that I ended up going to Carnegie Mellon University for a few years doing a postdoc with Professor Marcel Just and Professor Patricia Carpenter. I tried brain imaging. I didn't really like it. I didn't inhale. So I literally moved across the street and took a job as an assistant professor at the University of Pittsburgh. And I had wonderful collaborators there. So these are also people who I'm really indebted to. Professor Charles Perfetti, who was kind of an older mentor to me, and then Natasha Tokowitz and Tessa Warren, who were really my posse. They were my group. And I was very happy, very productive there for a number of years. While I was there, I took my first sabbatical in Delmenhorst, Germany. And you might ask, well, what's in Delmenhorst? Well, they have something called the Hansa Institute for Advanced Study. And they were kind enough to invite me over for a semester. And during that time, I was invited to a conference in China. I think Simon may have been the person to invite me. But at that conference, I met two other people who became very influential in my life and my research career. One is Simon, but the other one is this fellow, a guy named Yanping Liu, who I'm going to talk about in a little bit. He was a grad student at the time. Simon, I got to know Simon kind of in an informal setting. And he invited me to come to Southampton in the summer of 2008. So I came to Southampton for a month and had a wonderful time. Simon and I and Keith and Sandy wrote a paper which drew a lot of fire, which is a good thing. But it also kind of planted the seed, at least in my mind, for maybe possibly coming back to Southampton at some point in the future. I really kind of fell in love with Southern England. But anyhow, I went back home. And I developed, well, it was actually an idea that I had in graduate school. And at the time, when I was a professor, I really didn't have the computer expertise to execute the idea. And the idea was to, rather than to take existing literature on reading and from that extract a priori assumptions, theoretical assumptions, and then build a model around those assumptions. Instead, what would happen if you kind of build an artificial agent and you kind of hard built into the system, into the agent, constraints that everybody can agree on. So things like visual acuity is limited, or it takes a certain amount of time to program an eye movement, right? So these are uncontroversial assumptions. And then you allow these systems to learn how to move their own eyes so as to read as efficiently as possible. So that was the idea. And I was fortunate enough to have as my first graduate student a guy named Patrick Laurent, who had a very strong computer science background. And so what we did together is we really took on this project. And this project is an artificial intelligence project that uses a machine learning algorithm called reinforcement learning, which is inspired by biological reinforcement learning. So those of you who have had introductory psychology know that if you have a rat and you want it to learn how to do something, you feed it cheese, and over time you can get the rat to approximate the correct behavior. Or alternatively, if the rat's doing something and you hit it with a switch or something, it'll stop doing what it was doing and it'll do something else. So with reinforcement learning, that's basically the idea. So it specifies how an artificial agent, and in our case it's a reading agent, can use a low-dimensional error signal to learn which actions to execute from each given state so that the agent can learn to maximize the reward or minimize the punishment that it receives. Okay? And we used a very plain, vanilla, simple version of this, something called the value iteration algorithm. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through this with a concrete example. Hopefully it'll be understandable. And the example is going to involve a hypothetical frog who lives in a pond, but he can't swim. And so in order to go from his home to where he feeds every day, he has to hop across these lily pads. Okay? And because the frog is hungry, it's very adversive to him to take more than the necessary steps to move across this pond. Okay, so the way to think about it is every time he hops from one lily pad to the other, he receives a mild punishment because he wants to get to the other side of the pond to start eating. Okay, so in this example, there's a state space, which is two-dimensional, and it kind of corresponds to these lily pads. And you can see that initially, all of these lily pads have the same intrinsic value. They're not associated with any reward or any punishment, so they have values of 0. And these arrows represent the actions that the frog can take. And you can see that each one of these actions has a small negative value associated with it, a -1, which reflects the punishment for lingering around on the lily pads, with the exception of the goal state, where the one of the actions just remaining on the goal state has a 0 reward or 0 punishment value. Okay, so initially, the values of all these states are set equal to 0. And then, with each iteration of learning, the values of these states are updated using this equation. And what you can see is that this equation describes the value associated with a given state at time step I, and that value equals the value of that state in the previous time step, so time step I minus 1, plus some fixed proportion of everything that's in this set of brackets. And this fixed proportion, you can think about it as being a learning rate parameter that controls how quickly the agent, or the frog in this case, learns. Okay. Inside of these brackets, there are 3 terms. The first one reflects the reward that the frog will receive from a given state for executing a given action. The second one reflects the value, or some proportion of the value, that the frog anticipates receiving from the next state based on the value of that state in the previous time step. Then finally, from that, you subtract the value of the current state in the previous time step. Okay, so it looks kind of complicated, but just to walk you through, let's suppose the frog is in the goal state. From this state, initially, he would choose one of the actions at random. So the value of the state is 0. The learning rate parameter in orange is 0.1. The reward that he anticipates, let's just decide he's going to stay in this state. If he stays in that state, the reward he anticipates is going to be equal to 0. The value of the action from this state is equal to 0. The reward that he anticipates from remaining in this state based on its value in the previous time step is equal to 0. And then finally, you subtract from that the value 0, which is the value of that state in the previous time step. So if you crunch all the numbers, you end up with a value that's still equal to 0. Okay? So that's not that interesting. But let's suppose let's suppose the frog is in state F. Okay, from that state, it actually gets pretty interesting. So one of the actions the frog can execute is to actually move to the goal state. And the anticipated value of that state would be 0, right? But if you plug in the numbers and crank through, what you end up finding is that the value of this state now is updated to a slightly negative value, a value of negative 0.1. Okay? So if you go through this exercise and update all of these values, what you end up with is something like this, where you see that the goal state retains its value of 0, but the other states take on small negative values. So that's after the first iteration of learning. After the second iteration of learning, you can see that a gradient starts to emerge. The goal state has a value of 0. States adjacent to the goal state have values of negative 0.19, and states 2 moves away have values of negative 0.2. So if you continue this for n learning iterations, or up until the point that learning has completed, what you can see is you get this very nice gradient. So at this point in time, you can plop the frog down on a lily pad, and it basically just chooses to move to the state that has the least negative value associated with it. So at this point, the agent has enough information to perform the task. Okay, so this is kind of a simple-minded example using a silly frog in a 2-dimensional lily pad state space. The reading agents had a 9-dimensional space, and the agents had access to all sorts of information. So they know about how long the attended word has been processed, how many time steps have been spent processing that word, the number of character spaces between the point of fixation and the center of the word being processed, the length of that word, the length of the next word, and so on. Okay? So the agent has this information. It defines a 9-dimensional space. On top of that, the agent is given a task. The agent has to learn how to identify words and sentences as quickly as possible and in the correct order. And to do this, the agent can either continue processing the word that's currently being attended, and it can also choose to either initiate a saccadic program to move the eyes to a new location or shift attention to the next word. And to motivate the agents, what we did is we punished them with a value of -1 for every time step that they spent processing each of the sentences, and we rewarded them with +1 for every word that they identified. Okay? We made some a priori assumptions that, with the exception of the last one, should be completely non-controversial. So we assume that saccades take a certain amount of time to execute, that they're subject to motor error. We also assume that there are different types of words, 1, 3, 5, and 7-letter words that respectively take 4, 5, 6, and 7 time steps to identify. We assume that visual acuity is limited, so that words take longer to identify the further they are from the point of fixation. And then finally, that last assumption that is controversial, we assume that attention is allocated serially to one word at a time. Okay? I'm going to come back to this in a second. What we did is we ran these artificial agents on 20 8-word sentences, and we evaluated the agent's performance at different stages in learning. So after 10, 50, and 100 iterations of learning. Okay? So what I'm showing you here are fixation landing site distributions at 3 different stages in learning, after 10 iterations, 50, and 100. And for each one of these plots, I'm showing the landing sites, where 0 represents the blank space to the left of a word, 1 is the first letter position, 2 the second, and so on. And each one of these curves shows the fixation landing site distributions for either 1-letter words, 2-letter words, or 3-letter words, 5-letter words, or 7-letter words. And what you can see, there are 2 things to notice. One is the landing site distributions are centered on the words, which is consistent with what we see with human readers. The second thing to notice is that the distributions are approximately Gaussian in shape, which is again consistent with what we see with real people. Final thing to note is that the agents learn how to do this very quickly. So only after 10 iterations you can see that this behavior is starting to emerge. Okay, here what I'm showing you again across the 3 different stages of learning is the probability of making a single fixation in black, the probability of making 2 or more fixations in gray, and the probability of skipping in white. And if you go over here on the far right after learning is completed, you can see that the agents tend to fixate the long, difficult to process words more often than the shorter, easier to process words. And conversely, they tend to skip the shorter, easier to process words more than the longer, more difficult to process words. So again, this is consistent with what we see with people. Okay, here, slide's a little bit redundant, but what I'm showing you are 3 measures of fixation time. So the first fixation duration, which I've already mentioned, gaze duration, and then the total viewing time. So this is the total time spent looking at a word, even after a regression back to the word. And you can see that the agents fixate at the longer words for longer on average than the shorter words. That's consistent with what people do. They also attend to the longer words for more time than the shorter words. That's consistent with what people do. And then here's the thing that I think is really interesting. So with these agents, we don't tell them when to begin programming their eyes from one word to the next, right? They have a task to learn, but they get to decide when to do it. And the question is, when do they start initiating a saccadic program? Well, it could correspond to an early stage, something like when information first reaches the mind, or it could correspond to something very late, like full identification of the word, or it could be somewhere in between. And interestingly, what the agents learn to do, they learn to use information about word length to anticipate how long it would take to identify a given word. And then they would start initiating the saccadic program prior to the identification, so that after the program was initiated, the saccadic program would take a certain amount of time to actually be programmed, and the eyes would leave the word right as the word was being identified. Okay? So that's interesting because well, again, interim summary. I think the simulations with these agents demonstrate that these sophisticated eye movement behaviors can in fact emerge from really simple physiological and psychological constraints in combination with the goal of moving the eyes in a way that kind of maximizes reading efficiency. And the point that I kind of hesitated on are these 2 points. The first one is that learning where to move the eyes actually seems to be easier than learning when to move the eyes, at least with respect to how much time it takes the agents to learn both of these types of behavior. And then the second thing is that learning something like a familiarity check in the easy reader model, that is initiating the saccadic program prior to full identification of the word, actually allows the agents to move their eyes in a near optimal way, right? So they're not remaining on a word up to the point where the word has been fully identified, because that would then add additional time to program the eye movement and then move the eyes to the next word. Nor are they moving the eyes too soon, because that would result in having to shift attention back and continue processing the word that you just moved from a suboptimal viewing position. So the agents are really clever, even though they're very simple. However, one possible criticism of these simulations is that theoretical assumption that attention is allocated in a strictly serial manner. Okay, and so to address this limitation, what I did is I completed a second set of simulations where we actually allowed the agents to kind of dynamically control their own attention. So they got to decide whether or not they attended to 1 word at a time, 2 words, 3 words, or 4 words. Okay, and so this project was done in collaboration with Yanping Liu, the fellow that I met in China during my first trip. And he came over to Pittsburgh in 2010, 2011 to finish his PhD. And this work was actually a part of his PhD project. So what we did across 3 simulations, simulations 1A and 1B and simulation 2, is we allowed the agents to use these different types of attention gradients, right? So if you look at the top here, this gradient corresponds to strictly serial processing, where all of the processing resources are really focused on a single word. And in contrast, something like, let's take this one down here. Here, most of the processing is on the second word, but some processing also happens during each fixation from the word preceding it and the two following words. And to really kind of drive this point home, we completed a third simulation where we use these more extreme gradients. You can see that here, again, you have strictly serial processing, one word at a time. But down here, these gradients really correspond to completely distributing your attention across 4 words simultaneously. Okay, so in order to do this, we had to have these agents set up. And rather than a 9-dimensional space, it was something like a 13-dimensional space. And it really exceeded the capacity of the value iteration algorithm that I told you about earlier. So we opted to use artificial neural networks. And artificial neural networks are really good at learning all sorts of mathematical functions, but they're also, in and of themselves, really complicated. In particular, it's really difficult to decide in advance how to set up a neural network to kind of make it optimal for the type of learning task that you wanted to learn. So what we did is we decided to use genetic algorithms, basically through simulation, to evolve specific types of neural networks that were well suited to the types of tasks we were interested in. So if I want to make an analogy back to the frog example, you can kind of think about it as, well, we didn't start with the frog. Instead, we started with these simple fish, and we put it on the lily pad task, and over thousands and thousands of generations, we got something like a frog that was able to do the task. Okay? So with the genetic algorithms, we developed these neural networks. We evaluated them on the task. Those that were best able to do the task, we allowed to breed, to produce progeny, and they went on to the next generation. And over time, we developed these really sophisticated neural networks. Okay. So the next few slides are largely replication of what I showed you earlier. So these artificial neural network reading agents show the same types of landing site distributions as the previous artificial reading agents. They show similar patterns with respect to the probability of fixating once, fixating 2 or more times, and skipping words. That is, they tend to fixate the longer words more often than the shorter words, and they tend to skip the shorter words more often than longer words. They also tend to look at the longer words for longer than the shorter words. And they also initiate saccadic programming prior to full identification of a word, just like with the previous simulations. But here's the most interesting thing. So what I'm showing you here is a table showing the reading agent's preferences for the types of attention gradients that they used. And what you'll see is across the 3 simulations, on average, 96% of the time, they chose to do strictly serial processing, either that gradient or that one, right? Occasionally, they would choose one of the other gradients, and occasionally they would choose the 10th gradient when they would get short sequences of spatially adjacent words right at the end of the sentence. But overall, they definitely preferred serial processing. So from my perspective, this really strongly suggests that serial processing affords some inherent advantage related to how attention is used to process words during reading. And although the agents did occasionally distribute their attention across multiple words, that was by far in the minority of cases. And the reason why the serial allocation of attention may be more efficient is that it avoids problems associated with having to continue processing words on either side of a word that's already been identified. So I think there is a rational reason for why the agents, in fact, chose to do serial processing. Okay. I think I have a full hour, right? Okay. So after finishing this work, I went back to China. I think this was my 2nd time. And I met Dr. Draga. And one night we were out on a boat tour, and kind of in an offhand way, I just suggested that he come over to Pittsburgh. And a couple months later, there he is, living in my house for a month, drinking my bourbon. But at that time, he also suggested that he would write a Lieberhyme Grant to bring me over to Southampton for a year. And so he wrote the proposal. It got funded. And so a year later, I came to Southampton. I actually ended up staying here for 8 months. That was my Leverhulme Year. I had a really nice time with everybody. And despite all of those good times, all those fond memories, I was actually pretty productive too, because this is such a great group of people. And I mean that with all sincerity. So these are some of the papers that I published then. And I want to tell you about one of them. I want to tell you about the developmental review paper, because for me, this kind of pushed me a little bit in a new direction, which I think is really interesting. And that has to do with how eye movements change as a beginning child reader becomes a skilled adult reader. And across a number of studies, we know things like, well, children, first of all, they read more slowly. They read fewer words per minute. But their eye movements also look different in many ways. So they tend to make more fixations. They tend to make longer fixations. They make shorter saccades, more regressive saccades. And they also have a smaller perceptual span. So what we set out to do is to use the easy reader model to explore why this might be the case. And at that point in time, there were two competing hypotheses for why that's the case. One just has to do with linguistic proficiency. So the idea being that children's eye movements are slower because children are slower at either word identification or other linguistic processing. The other hypothesis, the oculomotor tuning hypothesis, is that children's eye movements themselves are intrinsically different to those of adults. So there's also work showing, for example, that if you have a child fixating across and you present a target over here and you instruct them to look the other way, the children are actually much poorer at that than adults. So what we did is we used the easy reader model using the default adult parameter values to generate predictions about the mean number of fixations per sentences, the mean fixation duration, mean saccade length, mean probability of regression, the overall reading rate, and the perceptual span measured in terms of the amount of parafoveal preview you get in milliseconds. And then relative to those values, using the adult parameters, we systematically manipulated the model's other parameters to see which ones could really account for the pattern that we observe with children. And I was really surprised by what we found. So in the end, increasing the value of the alpha 1 parameter, making it take on a larger value and thereby slowing lexical processing, that was the only parameter manipulation that was sufficient to account for the full set of findings that you observe with children. Right? So effectively what that says is that this one change, the efficiency or speed with which somebody can recognize words, is sufficient to explain the pattern of differences you see between a beginning child reader and a skilled adult reader. Okay, since that time I've been working on a number of follow-up projects. One of these is with a PhD student in computer science who came to my lab just this past year, a few months ago. And she was interested in individual differences in reading skill and its development. And she had a large corpus of data, eye tracking data, that she had collected with French speakers, adults and children. And she ran simulations with the easy reader model and was able to replicate the basic finding that in order to explain the differences between children and adults, you basically slow lexical processing. But in addition to that, she did some really nifty analyses where she looked at how the value of that parameter fitted to, well, she went back and she found the best fitting parameter for each individual child. And then she did analyses to see how those values across the children correlated with these various fixation duration measures, but also their psychometric test scores. So things like their orthographic skill, their knowledge of the writing of the language, their phonological skill, their comprehension skill, and their general intelligence. And the thing that's really neat about this is that the values of this parameter, of course they correlate with the fixation duration measures, but they also correlate with the orthographic skill psychometric test. So that suggests that the familiarity check that's posited to happen in the easy reader model really has something to do with the processing of orthographic form, the letter forms, rather than phonology or meaning. So I think that's interesting. Another project has been done in collaboration with Heather Sheridan, my postdoc, who's here. She got her PhD working with a colleague of mine, a guy named A.L. Reingold. And Eyal and I and Heather are very interested in kind of the time course of mental processing during reading. And we did a review last year where we reviewed the electrophysiological literature to see how long, to provide estimates for how long things like the eye-mind lag takes, how long it takes to visually encode information, how long it takes to complete some amount of lexical processing. And if you add all those numbers together, the interesting thing is that it leads to a very small amount of time for saccadic programming, an amount of time that isn't plausible. So by implication, one way to solve this problem and to allow for more time for saccadic programming is just to assume that a significant amount of processing actually happens in the parafovea. Right? So when you're looking at a word, you spend a considerable amount of time shifting attention to the next word and processing it. And if you make this assumption, it then frees up an adequate amount of time to allow for eye movement programming. Okay, all of this is kind of speculative, but Eyal and myself and Heather have done experiments where we look at eye movements on words and we manipulate variables that are related to word processing, and then we do a type of analysis called a survival curve analysis. And basically a survival curve analysis allows you to look at the percentage or the proportion of things that exist as a function of the passage of time. So in this really simple example, what I'm showing you here is the percentage of people who are still surviving as a function of their age and as a function of whether they are cigarette smokers, the dotted line, or non-smokers, the solid line. And so what you can see is that up until about age 35, there's no difference. But then somewhere, as they get older, you start seeing these two curves diverge. And that's because the smokers, on average, are going to be paying the consequences of smoking, and they're gonna die off at a rapid rate, more rapid rate than the non-smokers. So in these experiments that I mentioned with Eyal and Heather, what we did is similar types of analyses looking at the number of, or the percentage of fixations of a given duration as a function of whether a word is high frequency or low frequency, and as a function of whether the fixation that occurred on a word occurred in the inner 1/3, or a central location, the solid line, or the outer 1/3, the dotted line. And what you can see is that there's this nice separation between the curves at right around 150 milliseconds. Right? And this says something important about the time course of processing in real human readers, that word frequency first has an effect at about 150 milliseconds, as does the initial fixation location. So what Heather has done in her project is she's used the Easy Reader model to run simulations to basically see if the model predicted these types of patterns. And I was surprised, I know Heather was too, that the model in fact did do a really nice job. So if you generate artificial data with the model and run the same types of survival curve analyses, what you in fact see is that there are these divergence points for both word frequency and fixation location that occur at about 150 milliseconds post-fixation onset. So just to try to wrap this up, because it is a little bit over an hour now, I think at this stage in my career, my research has contributed in two really fundamental ways. So the work with Easy Reader, I think, provides a really nice concrete example and a framework for understanding the eye-mind link. That is how cognition relates to eye movement control in tasks like reading, but also other tasks that I didn't have the time to talk about. As such, I think the model has been really useful because it's motivated quite a bit of new empirical research, but also the development of competing models that have been used to really drive the research forward. And currently, I'm still using the model really as a framework for thinking about these issues, the perception, cognition, and motor processes that are involved in reading. The second program of research that I talked about involving the artificial reading agents, I think that's important because I think it really nicely demonstrates how these very sophisticated eye movement behaviors really can emerge from simple constraints and the simple goal of trying to read efficiently. And thinking about reading from that perspective, it suggests that the task of reading really is one of kind of optimizing efficiency. So you want to kind of maximize speed while maintaining some minimal level of comprehension. And you have to do this in the face of all of these constraints, some of them physiological, some of them psychological, and some of them based on cultural conventions, so the writing system that you're reading in. So that being said, I want to say one final thing. If you found this talk interesting, that's a big if, but myself and a number of people in economics and mathematical sciences are going to be launching a new speaker series called the Modeling Our World Speaker Series. And we're going to try to bring in speakers who really will bridge these three disciplines as well as others. And then in the coming few weeks, if you're interested, look out for these flyers because I'll give you more information about who the speakers will be and when they'll actually be speaking. And so with that, I want to just conclude by thanking all of you for being here. I really appreciate the fact that you came here and gave me your time listening to me ramble on about my work. I'm really indebted to all of these people. These are people who I've worked with over the years. Most of them I'm still currently working with. I feel very privileged to be a member of the Center for Vision and Cognition. As a career move for me, it was probably one of the few smart things I've ever done in my life is to come here and work with these great people. So with that, just thank you.